With a new trailer for Mafia 4 and more comments asking to cover other things in the Mafia games, I wanted to take this opportunity to highlight not just side characters, but the crime families in all three games. I've already covered the three main protagonists in depth. If you want to see those videos, there'll be cards you can click on, as well as they'll be linked down in the description. That being said, this is a summary of the Morello and Salieri crime family and the events of the first Mafia game. And before we discuss the Salieri crime family, we must talk of what came before. The family that first ruled over the city of Lost Heaven. The father of the mobs that would later spring up and wage war all over the city during the 1930s. That man and that family was none other than Felice Peppone, Don Peppone of the Peppone crime family. As a small disclosure, his personal history prior to founding the family in the early 1910s is unclear, but it is likely that, similar to many early American mafia bosses, he began his criminal career in Italy and later came to America seeking new opportunities. It also doesn't help that he became overshadowed in the history of Lost Heaven by mob figures that were much more ambitious and prominent than he was, such as Marco Morello and Ennio Salieri of the Morello and Salieri crime families respectively. Personal history known or not, much of what is established in Lost Heaven proceeded with Felice Peppone passing and would go on to be inherited and to some degree reshaped by his successors, who came from within his own family. Ennio Salieri, Marco Morello, Sergio Morello, Vincenzo Ricci, Luigi Marino, and Frank Coletti were all names that we would become familiar with during the events of the first Mafia game. By then they were long established within their positions in the criminal organizations, but they all got their start under Peppone. Ennio Salieri and Marco Morello were both capos in the Peppone crime family, where they not only became close friends, but became very knowledgeable on the rackets established around illegal businesses, a hierarchical system of ranks to establish which roles men held within the family, and how to encourage corruption among political figures and local police, ensuring the family was protected from the law. Younger, intimately knowledgeable of the businesses, and growing ambitious themselves, Morello and Salieri would soon begin to see opportunities and ways of doing things that weren't exactly aligned with Peppone's vision. Considering the Peppone crime family was the only existing one in Lost Heaven at the time, many of the connections within politics or law enforcement were probably not only extremely valuable but difficult to establish as it was. It naturally would have made more sense to just take over the organization that was already deep-rooted. The difficult part was just finding the right moment to do so, and of course how to do so without jeopardizing the integrity of the organization and the businesses. Morello and Salieri saw it as difficult enough, having two with their own vision, never mind having any more to divvy up the pie. And as they looked for a way to dethrone Peppone, a friendly appearance was dutifully upheld. By the time 1920 rolled around, Morello, Salieri, and Peppone were close and all seemed well with Peppone. Peppone and Salieri would even attend Morello's wedding, with Salieri being Morello's best man. Fast forward to 1922, just 2 years later, Don Peppone drowns in a lake. Publicly, the explanation behind the tragedy was believed to be a deal gone wrong or a freak accident. However, the truth was Morello and Salieri were behind his death. They orchestrated his killing privately and publicly, at least within what remained of the Peppone crime family. They decided to split the Peppone family and its territory in half between the two of them. This was the birth of the Morello crime family under Marco Morello and the Salieri crime family under Ennio Salieri. Sergio Morello, Marco's brother, would side with his brother, where he would eventually be established as an underboss of Morello, becoming his top earner, in charge of the unions and overseeing all goods imported into the city, as the docks was his main territory that he would oversee. The Morello crime family also inherited the Peppone's political and law enforcement connections, with the family's headquarters located in North Park. Salieri's headquarters, on the other hand, was located in Little Italy. Salieri wanted to have more of an ordinary man approach, contrasting to Morello. His bar in Little Italy that doubled as his base of operations, he would make sure that nobody cussed on the premises. It was just a matter of principle. Clean-cut, respected, safe type of look. In addition to this, Little Italy was meant to be a safe haven of sorts. Anything that would destroy lives or bring the look of the city down in this area was strictly prohibited, particularly the involvement of any kind of drugs. If Morello wanted to poison his side of the fence, so be it, but Salieri wanted to make it clear he would not dabble in anything of that sort. Lastly, even though Morello inherited the police connections and an objectively nicer part of the city, Salieri took in some useful members from his former former crime family. Vincenzo Ricci, otherwise known as Vinny, would initially serve as an enforcer for Salieri, and so he eventually was trusted enough to procure arms and other necessary gear for the family associates and soldiers, serving as the Salieri crime family's gunsmith and head of their armory. Luigi Marino, a feared hitman once upon a time, would join Salieri not as a hitman, but as a knowledgeable and overprotective bartender. He gave up the danger of taking lives after spending time in prison, coming out determined to do better for his daughter. Finally, there was Frank Coletti. He and Salieri had known each other since they were children, and Frank was a savant with numbers. Naturally, he would end up as the consigliere for the Don. As the 1920s went on, both the Salieri and Morello crime families grew and consolidated their power and influence. Morello continued to strengthen his pull over the political scene in Lost Heaven, as well as goes so far as to almost have the entire police force in his back pocket by the time the early 1930s rolled around. While Salieri grew in manpower, distinguishing his family and his methods from his counterpart, Salieri came to value quality and loyalty, finding such desirable characteristics in Paulie Lombardo and Sam Trapani. The two men would go on to be the most trusted enforcers working underneath Salieri, and the pair would go on to vouch for Thomas Angelo, the protagonist we play as in the first game, who would become a made man and in time an efficient hitman, playing a very vital role in the war that would eventually erupt between the two families. But until then, a friendly truce of sorts was held between both newly found families, and their priorities laid with maximizing their own profit. As the 1920s went on, both families grew. Both would get involved in similar rackets from bootlegging, gambling, protection, prostitution, car theft, and smuggling of goods. While a friendly appearance was kept between Morello and Salieri, claiming their friendship never officially ended, their men and their rackets would start to blur into one another. Men from both sides would occasionally target the other's rackets or the other's men. As incidents grew, tensions rose, and with it came a certain kind of animosity for people working for the other, extending to ignorant bystanders. When not officially at war, people found helping Salieri's men or Morello's became targets of the other family's enforcers. Morello's men specifically appeared to be much more aggressive towards anyone found helping Salieri's men, as Salieri did appear to be the lesser of the two evils, encouraging his men to not get physically violent against people that owe them money unless they absolutely needed to. Since the police and most political influence was looking out for Morello, Salieri's only remaining leverage against a man who was attempting to slowly choke him out was to not scare people away and coax others into working with him, a tactic that worked during the Prohibition, where Morello's men would break the nose of a whiskey smuggler, sending him straight into the arms of Don Salieri and establishing a very lucrative business deal between the two of them. Their aggression towards Thomas Angelo was also what sent him to get involved with the Salieri crime family in 1930. He began as a humble cab driver, but was forced at gunpoint to help Paulie and Sam escape Morello's men and return to the safety of Salieri's bar. As retaliation, he'd get attacked with his cab smashed to pieces for helping Paulie and Sam escape Morello's men. Having no other choice, he would run back on foot to Salieri's bar and not only get saved by the two men he saved, but would even ask for permission from Don Salieri himself to get back at the men that attacked him. So dictated the rules of engagement. Both sides would hit the other whenever they could, but home turf was off limits as official war was to be avoided. Respect and fear of needless bloodshed aside, it was becoming evident to both sides Morello was tipping the balance of power in his favor. Every dollar Salieri was making, Morello was seeing 10. He could afford to pay off cops, politicians, judges. If they weren't bought, they were scared. Morello was so powerful, in fact, that he was able to beat a famous boxer to death in the street, in front of police officers, and nothing happened to him. A public display that this wasn't just becoming his city and his city alone, but he was someone that you wouldn't want to mess with. By Thomas Angelo's own accounts, Morello would even come to know when the Salieri crime family was beginning to bleed money long before they knew it themselves. During the late 1920s, Morello was already making a few discreet moves on Salieri's rackets here and there that would go unnoticed, but after Salieri's men had killed a senator's son and then had to publicly kill the remaining survivor of the initial hit during a funeral procession, they'd be forced to lay low for the following 7-8 months, during which Morello would aggressively move on the offensive, taking over as many of the Salieri crime family's rackets as he possibly could. Despite taking advantage of the 7 to 8 months of the Salieri crime family essentially doing whatever they could to stay out of trouble, forfeiting many streams of revenue, it still wasn't enough to completely stomp out the Salieri crime family. So in 1933, Morello would take the initiative to get rid of his rival and former friend once and for all. The initial move would be Morello striking a deal with the FBI. He was hoping to build a case against Ennio Salieri, and Morello knew exactly how to build this case. Targeting his former associate from his Peppone days, Frank Coletti, a vital asset to the Salieri crime family as he was the consigliere and bookkeeper, Morello would use Frank's family as hostage in exchange for the books Frank kept on the businesses of Salieri, legal and otherwise. Don Salieri would discover this and instruct Thomas Angelo to kill Frank and retrieve the books he stole. Out of the kindness of his own heart and understanding for Frank's difficult position, Thomas would spare him, allowing him to get on a plane and flee the country after Frank provided the key to a lockbox where the Don's stolen books were kept. Thomas Angelo would secure the books and go on to burn down Frank's house to further convince Salieri the job of killing Frank was complete. A few days later, a funeral would be held for Frank Coletti, where Salieri and Morello would meet face to face after all this time. Enforcers from both sides of the families were present, and despite both sides claiming lives and money from each other over the years, as well as knowing how and why Frank and his family were killed, the peace here was kept. Both Morello and Salieri mourned and honored the legacy of their mutual friend, albeit with a heavy thickness in the air. The next few years, Morello continued to lobby for politicians and police officers eager to take out his adversary, while Salieri was playing catch-up for the financial losses suffered from that 8-month period of laying low and the loss of his advisor Frank. He began to also have plans of getting out of Morello's shadow, beginning in the year of 1934, during which prohibition was lifted, resulting in the money both families made from illegal alcohol drying up. Seeing an opportunity within this, Salieri took some of the capital earned from prohibition and invested in legitimate businesses. Restaurants, construction, and trucking are just to name a few of how he expanded. Even Paulie and Sam began to expand and have little rackets on their own, all bringing in capital for the Salieri crime family. With a new revenue of streams, legally and otherwise keeping the family's pockets lined, the Don began to look to the one area Morello always had over him: law. The ambition of building his own strong connection to politicians and police officers would be the breaking point for Morello, triggering the next phase of the Morello-Salieri conflict. 1935 was the year all the tension built up between both sides was finally released, leading to full-scale war. Home turf such as Little Italy, Salieri's Bar, North Park, and other well-known hangouts for Morello's men, or Salieri's, were no longer safe havens, but war zones. And it all started with a blatant assassination attempt on Don Salieri's life. In broad daylight, while having lunch at his favorite restaurant in what was considered neutral territory between the families, a squad of hitmen would pull up, exit their vehicle, and without hesitating, opened fire on all of the occupants inside the building. Thomas Angelo was the only enforcer present, but being outnumbered was not enough to ensure the hit was successful. Thomas Angelo and Don Salieri would not only survive the hit, but would manage to kill all of the hitmen and go on to track down Salieri's former personal chauffeur, as it was him who tipped Morello off on where Salieri would be, giving the hitman the intel necessary to carry out the hit. After surviving the attempt on his life, Salieri immediately converted his bar into nothing short of a makeshift military base. Weapons were a more common sight on the bar's premises now than ever before, and they were complemented with meticulously picked out targets and planned routes of engagements, and if need be, quick escapes. Now, the early phase of this war required Salieri to first weaken Morello. He wasn't able to immediately target the family's men or hangouts, as the politicians and judges were still in Morello's pocket, meaning they were still somewhat untouchable. So the first order of business was taking out any politicians that had any connections to the Morello crime family and use them to send a message. To affiliate themselves with Morello was to put yourself on Don Salieri's shit list. And they knew where to begin, with a city councilor by the name of Roberto Galati. Galati's been a staunch opponent against the Salieri crime family since the enforcers of Salieri's unknowingly killed his son for attacking Thomas Angelo and Sarah Marino on Salieri's turf. They mistook him for a regular enforcer of Morello's, completely unaware that they had pushed a determined politician right into the hands of Marcoux. Galati's been a thorn in Salieri's side since 1932, but now he was the perfect target, who presented a prime opportunity to be taken out, as he was hosting a birthday party for himself on a steamboat. Thomas Angelo would sneak on board, acquire a pistol that was previously stashed away for him, and proceeded to assassinate the counselor in broad daylight. Salieri's men had moved against witnesses and some police officers quietly before, but never so boldly or as big as a target as Galati was. It appeared to be enough to slowly open up other opportunities where Salieri could hit Morello without having to worry about legal ramifications or powerful people in Morello's back pocket. Bystanders were sure to stay as clear from the bloodshed as humanly possible. Even with hits being carried out by both sides, the struggle was almost evenly matched until the death of Sergio Morello, Don Morello's brother and his top earner. Salieri's men had been trying to get a hold of him as soon as politicians and police officers started to back off. But as I said, the bastard had a lucky rabbit's foot up his ass and always managed to escape them somehow. Tired of their inability to deal with him and wanting to send another message directly to Morello and the entire city, Salieri intended to kill Sergio with a bomb planted under his vehicle. Now the hit inadvertently ended up killing Sergio's wife instead of Sergio, who was on the other side of town. But this was just a minor hiccup, and determined to not lose him again, Salieri would put his best hitman, Paulie Lombardo, Sam Trapani, and Thomas Angelo, to arrive at the diner where Sergio was. All three men pull up to the diner, machine guns locked and loaded, ready to kill all the occupants inside. And it would have happened then and there had it not been for Thomas Angelo stopping Paulie from opening fire on Sergio, who was using a waitress as a body shield. Angelo's refusal to kill an innocent woman did help Sergio escape the hail of bullets at the diner, but it was only for a short time, as Thomas Angelo would hunt Sergio down to the docks in Lost Heaven. Under the false sense of security, thinking his men can save him, all Sergio did was help many of them die at the docks, including himself, as Thomas would corner him and blow him up inside his own warehouse. The death of Sergio was the turning point in the Morello-Salieri War. Don Morello had lost his brother, and his organization was severely crippled as their main revenue source was now lost. In the coming weeks, the remainder of the war was only described as pure chaos. The balance had tipped in Salieri's favor. Nothing was holding him or his men back from an aggressive and extremely hostile takeover of the city. Car bombs, open hits on train cars, and ferocious firefights in the streets were more common than ever. Morello's power over the city was rapidly fading, especially since he had gone into hiding almost immediately after his brother was killed. The lack of Morello's presence in a city that was his less than a year ago was a major blow to his power in of itself. But as both families knew, until Morello was officially put in the ground, he was a problem. A problem that remained hidden until the city's newspaper published a gala coming up. All of the city's top officials were going to be in attendance here, from the city's mayor all the way to the police chief and other top officials. And it was none other than Morello himself that was hosting this charity event. Perceiving this as Morello taunting him, Salieri instructed the top three hitmen to hit Morello as he was leaving the theater, right in front of the mayor, police chief, and anyone else who might have some sort of power here within the city. It was a clear and direct message that this was now Salieri's city, and if you crossed Salieri or his men, you were dead. The trio would huddle up into a vehicle, and as they were coming down the main street, Morello was walking out of the venue. Aware of the men quickly approaching, the Don jumped into his vehicle where Salieri's men chased him down to the airport. Despite Morello making it onto his aircraft, Salieri's men shot out the engine, forcing the plane to crash land. While crawling from the wreckage, the former ruler of the city was riddled with bullets by a man who was just a humble cab driver a few years before.
Bastard's daddy doesn't even know it yet. He knows it now.
And with that, the Morello and Salieri War was officially over. Morello's death meant Salieri was the one calling the shots in the city of Lost Heaven. There was no more any other family or rival to give him or his men any kind of trouble. For the next few years, he'd continue to consolidate the power he had and take over the political connections his former opponent had. All was going great for the Salieri crime family until 1938. The family began to crumble on itself. Paulie and Tommy were beginning to feel the wear and tear of the dangerous life, from doubts and when their time would come or who it would be by. A feeling that was only made worse when they discovered Don Salieri lied to them and was getting involved in drugs, a type of business he passionately was against just a few years ago. Believing the man they worked for no longer existed, and wanting a better life for themselves, the pair decided to rob a bank to procure the funds for their freedom. This was against Don Salieri's knowledge. They knew this would get them into trouble with the Don, but were hopeful that if they pulled this off and paid the man a large sum of cash, he would forgive them. Instead, all it did was put them on a hit list. Paulie was killed less than 24 hours after the robbery, while Tommy would not only escape the attempted hit on him just a few hours later, but kill Paulie's gunman, who happened to be none other than their former comrade and best friend, Sam. For the next few months, Thomas Angelo would go into hiding, paranoid of trusting anyone and desperate to keep his wife and baby daughter safe. And he was able to somewhat do so until he ran out of money and options. which forced him later in 1938, after months of hiding, to contact Detective Norman. Detective Norman was working with the Lost Heaven Police Department, and he was tasked with solving the murder of Don Morello. That was Thomas Angelo's ticket. Not only would Thomas explain his entire time with the Salieri crime family to Detective Norman, he would also explain that he was the gunman that killed Don Morello, the exact man that he's been looking for. But on top of all of this, he's not asking for his freedom. Thomas Angelo was asking for the safety of his wife and daughter. If Detective Norman can promise him that his wife and daughter will be placed in protective custody, granted new identities, and moved far away from Lost Heaven, not only would Thomas Angelo give himself up as the killer of Don Morello, but he would also hand Don Salieri to the detective on a silver platter. And Thomas had the perfect thing that would do that. The financial books that Frank Coletti has been keeping on the Salieri crime family has been with Thomas Angelo for the last couple years. Salieri never asked for the possession of that book back, so when Frank stole it and Thomas allowed him to escape on the plane, while Thomas Angelo claimed he killed Frank Coletti to the Don assumed the records were taken care of, but they've been in Thomas's possession the entire time. And those books had more than enough evidence to put the Don away for good. So for the safety of his family, Thomas Angelo would give himself and those books up. He would serve 8 years in prison and put away every important member of the Salieri crime family behind bars. Now presumably that would be where Ennio Salieri would die, although in 1951, as a retaliation for this, there would be a hit put out on Thomas Angelo that is later carried out by none other than Vito Scaletta, the protagonist of the second Mafia game. So the life and the danger is full circle. Like I said, this video is a good companion video of sorts for the video that I did on Thomas Angelo. If you want to check that out, please do so. In the meantime, maybe consider subscribing, as I will be covering the other Mafia games and some other stuff besides Mafia. But until then, I hope you enjoyed this one.